Morning, it's March 14th, and this is To My Liberal Friends. In his State of the Union address, Joe Biden proudly told us that inflation was coming down. He boasted it had been reduced from a peak of 9% to 3%. And that was designed to make us feel like his programs were working and we should all look forward to better times. But as they say in the movies, something happened on the way to the church. In the month of January, the downward movement of inflation stalled out, and it remained at 3.1%. Sounds good, doesn't it? But in February, those numbers started to tick back upwards, and the number was 3.2%. And that means the Consumer Price Index showed prices rising 0.4% from the previous month and 3.2% more than last February. One of the contributors to the increase was the increase in gas prices. Another thing Biden touted is coming down. Now, in my area where I live, they're about 30 cents per gallon higher than they were a month ago. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics, the agency that releases these numbers, also put out a core basis which strips out the more volatile cost of food and gas, and prices in February climbed another 0.4% and was 3.8% over the same time last year. Not exactly what Biden was boasting about in his State of the Union speech. So what does this mean to us going forward? The biggest impact will be on the Federal Reserve's decision on when to start cutting interest rates. Inflation has stubbornly remained above the Fed's target of 2%. There have been hopes that it would be cutting rates by now. The stock market experts began the year betting on 6 cuts starting this month, but they have now changed that expectation to 3 cuts and perhaps starting in June or maybe later. Well, this is an election year, and Democrats are not happy about the Fed holding back on cutting interest rates. They believe the 2% goal is unrealistic and want rates cut now. They want rates cut to bolster their election prospects in November. Senator Sherrod Brown, the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, he's in a tough re-election effort in Ohio. He's openly questioned their lack of action and suggested to Chairman Powell in a hearing last week that, quote, quickly cut rates to prevent workers from losing their jobs, end quote. Forget about the rest of us paying higher prices. Over in the House, Brad Sherman, an ultra-liberal congressman from California, showed his unhappiness with the lagging effort to cut interest rates. During questioning, he asked where the goal of 2% came from and was it realistic? I can answer that question for him. The goal of 2% came from an off-the-cuff comment by Roger Douglas, then the Minister of Finance in New Zealand, where the nation was facing high inflation. This was way back in the 1980s. By adopting strong measures, New Zealand was able to drop their inflation rate from 15% in 1986 to about 1% by 2000. It stabilized their economy. The U.S. Federal Reserve watched this and adopted this standard in 2012. This has never sat well with the political left of the country. In those hearings, the House and Senate Chairman Powell acknowledged the origin of the 2% standard, indicated it was not going to change anytime soon, and made it clear that this become the global standard. He also stated that in his opinion, it would not be a problem for the U.S. to meet the global goal sometime later this year. So what does all this mean to the average American? It tells me that Chairman Powell is not inclined to lower the interest rates at a rapid pace. He's sticking to the 2% goal of inflation. Of course, Democrats want to use a higher number because it helps their election efforts this November. With interest rates remaining higher, it will continue to make it difficult to get a mortgage that the average American can afford. And that affects the housing market at every level. If the first-time home buyer cannot get that starter home because he cannot afford the mortgage, then the person selling the home can't sell it. That means they cannot buy the larger home they would like to buy as their family grows. And up the chain it goes until finally people retiring cannot sell their home and buy a home where they want to retire. This is what forced Joe Biden to announce in the State of the Union address that he's proposing a $400 a month subsidy for 2 years for home buyers. Now, I'm not sure where he thinks that money is going to come from. One of the major causes of inflation was increased government spending and printing money that we don't have. If we continue to do that, inflation will never be tamed. But don't tell that to Joe. He's trying to buy your vote. Another sign about interest rates popped this morning. The Labor Department said today that its Producer Price Index, which tracks inflation before it reaches consumers, rose 0.6% from January to February, up from 0.3% the previous month. Measured year over year, producer prices rose 1.6% in February, the most since last September. It was gas prices, as I mentioned earlier, rising by 6.8% that was a major driver in this increase. Wholesale groceries also jumped 1%, which was larger than expected. Yet even excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core inflation was still higher than expected in February. Core wholesale prices rose 0.3%, down from the 0.5% jump the previous month. Compared with a year ago, core prices climbed 2%, the same as the previous month. Core inflation, which tends to provide a better sign of inflation may be headed, is watched closely. Still, February's acceleration in producer prices suggests that inflation would stay elevated into the spring. Economists in Wall Street expected the Fed to cut its benchmark, as I said, in the spring, but that could slip later this year. None of this is good news for Biden and is the source of the Democrats calling for the Fed to use a higher rate to signal interest rates cuts. But so far, Powell and the rest of the Fed are not listening. It's been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.